Donald's routine trip through airport security turned into a $12 million lesson in respect. Tonight, former TSA officer Bradley Morrison is out of a job and facing a federal lawsuit after confronting a passenger he didn't realize was a decorated Navy SEAL. My client has served this country with honor.
He refused to pat down and then started raising his voice.
My ID. Go ahead. Right rear pocket.
See, he's acting like
wallet coming out. Military ID.
Thank you.
Quietly Navy Special Warfare.
Got it. Would you like to file a complaint, sir? Yes, my lawyer's on the phone already.
This is counsel for Mr.
We'll cooperate fully.
The fluorescent lights of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport hummed with their familiar institutional drone as Marcus Thompson approached the TSA security checkpoint at Terminal B. It was 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, and the terminal was already thick with business travelers and families heading to spring break destinations. Marcus moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to navigate far more dangerous environments than airport security lines. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the kind of composed alertness that came from 23 years of military service, including 14 deployments to combat zones across the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. His shoulders were broad beneath his simple navy blue polo shirt, and his close-cropped hair showed the first touches of gray at the temples. A small scar above his left eyebrow told a story he rarely shared, from a night in Fallujah that had earned him his second Bronze Star. He was traveling light that morning, carrying only a black carry-on bag and a leather messenger bag containing his laptop, some documents, and a dog-eared copy of Marcus Aurelius. He was headed to San Diego for a military conference where he'd been invited to speak about tactical leadership and team resilience. The line moved slowly. When he reached the document check podium, he handed over his boarding pass and driver's license to a tired-looking TSA agent who barely glanced at his face before waving him through. Marcus placed his bags on the conveyor belt, removed his shoes, belt, and watch, and stepped into the full-body scanner with his arms raised. The machine beeped. A yellow indicator appeared on the screen, highlighting his lower back area. This wasn't unusual. Marcus had 3 titanium screws in his L4 and L5 vertebrae, souvenirs from a helicopter crash in Afghanistan in 2014. He'd long ago learned to approach these situations with patience. The TSA agents were just doing their jobs. What happened next would shatter any notion that this was going to be a routine screening. The agent who approached him was a white man in his mid-50s, with a thick neck and a pronounced belly straining against his blue uniform shirt. His name tag read Gerald Whitmore, and his eyes swept over Marcus with an expression that Marcus had seen before many times throughout his life. Gerald Whitmore pointed at Marcus with a thick finger. "You. Step over here. Secondary screening." Marcus nodded calmly and moved to the designated area. He knew the drill. He would explain about the titanium in his back, they would do a pat-down, and he'd be on his way. But Gerald Whitmore wasn't interested in following standard procedure. "Spread your arms. Spread your legs. Don't move." The commands were barked with unnecessary aggression, loud enough that nearby passengers turned to look. Marcus complied, keeping his expression neutral. He'd faced far more intimidating situations than an angry TSA agent. The pat-down that followed was deliberately rough. Whitmore's hands pressed harder than necessary, lingered longer than protocol required. Marcus felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but kept it contained, locked away in the same mental compartment where he'd learned to store his emotions during combat. "What's in your bag?" Whitmore demanded. "A laptop, some documents, a book. Nothing prohibited." Whitmore grabbed the messenger bag and began rifling through it. He pulled out the laptop, flipped through the conference briefing papers labeled with Marcus's name and credentials, then picked up the worn copy of Meditations and snorted dismissively before tossing it back. "What kind of documents are these?" "Conference materials. I'm speaking at a defense symposium in San Diego." Whitmore's laugh was ugly, dismissive. "Right. You're a speaker at a defense conference, and I'm the Queen of England." Marcus felt the eyes of other passengers on him. A few pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. "Sir, I can provide credentials if you'd like to verify my identity. I'm a retired Navy SEAL, and I've been invited to speak at the Naval Special Warfare Foundation's annual leadership conference." The words seemed to enrage Whitmore rather than satisfy him. His face reddened, and he stepped closer to Marcus. "A Navy SEAL? You expect me to believe that? You people are always making up stories. Drug dealers, gang members, always got some excuse." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. "You people." It was such a small phrase, just 2 words, but it contained centuries of prejudice. He'd served his country for 23 years. He'd bled for it. He'd watched friends die for it. And here, in the security line of an American airport, he was being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype. I'd like to speak with your supervisor, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through his veins. You don't get to make demands here. Whitmore grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip unnecessarily tight. You're coming with me for additional screening. Take your hands off me. Marcus's voice was quiet but carried a weight that made several nearby passengers step back instinctively. Whitmore didn't release his grip. Instead, he squeezed harder. Resisting a federal officer, that's a crime, you know. You're not a federal officer, you're a TSA agent, and I'm asking you to follow proper procedure. Something in Marcus's tone seemed to penetrate Whitmore's hostility. He released Marcus's arm but didn't step back. Fine. We'll do this by the book. But when we find whatever you're hiding, you're going to prison. The private screening room was small and sterile, furnished with nothing but a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. A camera in the corner recorded everything. Whitmore directed Marcus to stand against the wall and began a second pat-down, even more aggressive than the first. Take off your shirt, Whitmore commanded. That's not standard procedure for a metal detector alarm. I said take off your shirt. Marcus chose to comply, knowing the camera was his witness. He removed his shirt slowly, revealing a torso that told the story of his service. The scars were numerous. A puckered bullet wound on his left shoulder, a long surgical scar down his right ribcage, the raised marks of shrapnel on his lower back. Whitmore's expression flickered. What's all this? You get these in a gang fight? Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. These are combat wounds. Anyone can say they're a SEAL. You got proof? My DD-214 is in my checked luggage. My retirement credentials are in my wallet. My trident pin is at home next to 3 bronze stars, 2 purple hearts, and a silver star. Whitmore left the room abruptly. Marcus heard him speaking to someone in the hallway, fragments reaching him. Suspicious individual. Uncooperative. Possible threat. The door opened and a woman entered. Her badge identified her as Supervisory Transportation Security Officer Patricia Mendez. Mr. Thompson, I understand there's been some confusion with your screening. Confusion is one word for it. Marcus provided his identification and military credentials. Mendez examined each document carefully, her expression shifting to concern. Mr. Thompson, are you the Marcus Thompson, Silver Star recipient for the operation in Syria? I don't talk about classified operations, ma'am. But yes, I've received a Silver Star. Mendez sat down across from him. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Marcus recounted the entire encounter in precise detail. When he finished, Mendez stood up. I want to apologize on behalf of the Transportation Security Administration. What you've described is completely unacceptable. I'm going to personally escort you to your gate. I appreciate that. But an apology doesn't change what happened. And I suspect I'm not the first person Agent Whitmore has treated this way. Mendez's expression confirmed his suspicion without her saying a word. Marcus made his gate with 20 minutes to spare. As the plane pushed back, his mind was already working through his options. He had connections in Washington, friends in the Pentagon. But something deeper was stirring too. He thought about all the other black men who had been treated this way, who didn't have military credentials to flash, who simply had to endure. By the time the plane landed in San Diego, Marcus Thompson had made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. The videos from Atlanta went viral within hours. More than 2 million people watched the footage captured by fellow passengers, showing Whitmore's aggressive demeanor, his dismissive laughter when Marcus mentioned being a Navy SEAL, and Marcus's calm, dignified response throughout. Marcus delivered his speech at the Naval Special Warfare Foundation conference the next morning, transforming his prepared remarks about leadership into something more personal. He told them about growing up in Baltimore with a single mother, about the recruiter who changed his life, about missions he could discuss and others he couldn't, about friends lost and enemies defeated. And then he told them about Atlanta, about being called a liar when he stated his credentials, about being manhandled and humiliated and accused of crimes he hadn't committed, about the look on Gerald Whitmore's face, the casual certainty of a man who believed he knew exactly what kind of person Marcus Thompson was without knowing anything at all. The room gave him a standing ovation. Afterward, a Navy captain pressed a business card into his hand. This is my brother-in-law, civil rights attorney in Washington. Best in the business. Call him today. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. It named Gerald Whitmore, the TSA, and the Department of Homeland Security as defendants, seeking $12 million in damages for violations of Marcus Thompson's civil rights. The complaint detailed every moment of the encounter, supported by witness statements, security camera footage, and the viral videos viewed more than 50 million times worldwide. It documented Whitmore's history of 14 previous allegations of racially discriminatory treatment over 7 years, none of which had resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. What emerged during discovery was worse than Marcus had imagined. Internal emails showed supervisors had been aware of complaints against Whitmore for years. Training records demonstrated Whitmore had never completed required courses on diversity. Deposition testimony revealed he had bragged about giving extra attention to passengers he considered suspicious based on their appearance. 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, the government requested a settlement conference. They knew they were going to lose. The settlement was for $12 million. $2 million would go to Marcus directly. The remaining $10 million would fund the Thompson Foundation for Civil Rights Education, dedicated to training law enforcement personnel on implicit bias and constitutional rights. But the money wasn't the most important part. The government agreed to mandatory bias training for all TSA personnel, a new complaint system with independent oversight, body cameras for secondary screenings, and public reporting requirements for discrimination complaints. And Gerald Whitmore was terminated. Not quietly reassigned, but fired for cause. Marcus held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse in Atlanta, the same courthouse where civil rights leaders had fought for equality 60 years earlier. "This settlement is not a victory for me," he began. "It's a victory for every person who has been treated unfairly because of the way they look. It's a victory for every American who has been made to feel like a stranger in their own country." Humiliates looked directly into the cameras. "I spent 23 years serving in the United States military. But freedom isn't just about defeating foreign enemies. It's about living up to our own ideals. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect." The Thompson Foundation opened its doors 18 months later. Within its first year, it had trained over 10,000 officers from more than 200 agencies. Marcus wrote a best-selling book about his experiences, testified before Congress 3 times, and built coalitions that crossed racial and political lines. But his proudest moments came in quieter settings. A letter from a young black man inspired to join the military after hearing his story. A phone call from a police chief who credited the foundation's training with preventing violence in his department. A conversation with his son, now a college freshman studying criminal justice, who wanted to continue the work they had started together. Gerald Whitmore faded into obscurity, moving to rural Georgia, unable to find work in security or law enforcement. There were reports he had found religion and apologized publicly. Marcus never sought him out. Some wounds weren't meant to be healed, only survived. Marcus often returned to the Atlanta airport, pausing at the security checkpoint in Terminal B, remembering the morning that changed his life. The fluorescent lights still hummed. The lines still moved slowly. The TSA agents still did their jobs. But something was different now. Something had changed. And Marcus Thompson, standing there looking like any other traveler, allowed himself a small smile. He had made a difference. He had fought back. He had won. And in the end, that was all any of us could hope to do. 5 years had passed since that morning in Terminal B when Marcus Thompson found himself standing in the very same spot. Though everything around him had changed. The security checkpoint had been renovated, the old scanners replaced. With newer technology, the lighting softer and more welcoming. But what struck Marcus most was the small plaque mounted on the wall near the entrance, placed there by the Atlanta Airport Authority without his knowledge or consent. It read, "Thompson Checkpoint, named in honor of Marcus Thompson, whose courage transformed how we treat every traveler who passes through these doors." He hadn't come to Atlanta for the plaque. He'd come because his son, Darius, was graduating from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in nearby Brunswick, Georgia. 22 years old now, Darius had chosen to follow a path his father never expected, joining the Transportation Security Administration as part of a new generation of agents trained under the very protocols Marcus had fought to establish. When Darius told him about the decision 2 years earlier, Marcus had felt a complicated mix of emotions: pride, concern, and something that took him months to identify as hope. The graduation ceremony was held on a bright Saturday morning, with families crowded into an auditorium that smelled of floor polish and anticipation. Marcus sat in the front row beside his ex-wife, Sandra, with whom he'd maintained a respectful friendship despite their divorce years before the airport incident. She reached over and squeezed his hand when Darius walked across the stage to receive his certificate, and Marcus felt tears he didn't try to hide rolling down his cheeks. Afterward, they gathered outside for photographs. Darius looked sharp in his new uniform, standing tall with the same quiet confidence his father had always carried. Other graduates and their families milled around them, and Marcus noticed several of them glancing his way, recognizing him, whispering to each other. He was used to it now, though he'd never grown comfortable with fame. A young woman approached, her graduation certificate clutched in her hands. She was perhaps 25, with dark skin and nervous eyes. That reminded Marcus of himself at that age, hungry for purpose, uncertain of his place in the world. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to thank you." Marcus smiled warmly. "Congratulations on your graduation. What's your name?" "Keisha Williams, sir. I grew up in Baltimore, same neighborhood as you. My grandmother used to tell me stories about your mother, how she worked at the same hospital as her." Keisha paused, gathering courage. "When I saw what happened to you at the airport, I was 16. I remember thinking, if they can do that to a Navy SEAL, what chance do any of us have? I was so angry, so hopeless." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "But then I watched you fight back. I watched you turn something ugly into something meaningful. And I thought, maybe there's another way. Maybe instead of being angry at the system, I could be part of changing it from the inside." She gestured at her uniform. "So here I am. Because of you." Marcus felt his throat tighten. This was why he'd fought. This was what made every difficult moment worth it. He reached out and shook her hand firmly. "You're going to do great things, Keisha Williams. I can see it in you. Just remember why you're doing this. Remember what it feels like to be on the other side of that checkpoint. To be scared and vulnerable and hoping the person with the badge will treat you like a human being. Hold on to that. It's the most important qualification you have." Keisha nodded, blinking back tears of her own. "I will, sir. I promise." After she walked away, Darius came up beside his father and put an arm around his shoulders. He was taller than Marcus now, broader too, though he carried himself with the same humble dignity. "You know she's not the only one, right?" Darius said. "In my training class of 42 people, at least a dozen mentioned you as the reason they joined. They call themselves Thompson's kids. It's a whole thing." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "Thompson's kids? They've got a group chat and everything. Share articles about civil rights, discuss how to handle difficult situations, hold each other accountable. Some of them are going to be supervisors someday. Directors, maybe. And they all trace it back to what you did." That evening, Marcus and Darius sat together on the porch of the house Marcus had bought in Atlanta after the settlement. A modest craftsman bungalow in a quiet neighborhood where he could hear birds singing in the morning and children playing in the streets. They drank sweet tea and watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The same sky that stretched over the airport where everything had changed. "I've been thinking about what Grandma used to say," Darius said after a long, comfortable silence, "about how every generation has to fight the same battles, just in different ways. You think that's true?" Marcus considered the question carefully. His mother had died 3 years ago, peacefully in her sleep, having lived long enough to see her son become a symbol of something larger than himself. She'd never been comfortable with the attention, preferring to stay in the background. But Marcus knew she'd been proud. He kept a photograph of her on his nightstand, taken at his Navy graduation 30 years before. Her smile brighter than any medal he'd ever earned. "I think she was right. But I also think it's not the whole story," Marcus finally said. "Yeah, the battles keep coming. Prejudice doesn't die just because you pass a law or win a lawsuit. It hides, adapts, finds new ways to express itself. But here's what I've learned. Every fight we win makes the next one a little easier. Every person we reach makes the circle of understanding a little wider. We might not see the promised land in our lifetime, but we can make sure our children get closer to it than we did." Darius was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you never stayed angry? Even after everything Whitmore did to you, you never talked about him with hate. I always wondered about that." Marcus set down his glass and turned to face his son directly. "I was angry, Darius. Don't ever think I wasn't. There were nights after it happened when I couldn't sleep, when all I could think about was everything I wished I'd said, everything I wished I'd done. But anger is like fire. It can burn down your house or it can cook your food. It all depends on what you do with it." He paused, searching for the right words. Gerald Whitmore was a man who let fear and ignorance poison his heart. I don't know what happened in his life to make him that way, what wounds he was carrying, what lies he'd been told about people who looked like me. None of that excuses what he did. But hating him would have only poisoned my own heart. And I had too much work to do to waste my energy on hate. The last light of day faded, and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the distance, a plane climbed into the sky, its lights blinking as it carried hundreds of passengers toward destinations unknown. Marcus watched it until it disappeared, thinking about all the journeys taking place at that very moment, all the people passing through security checkpoints around the world, all the small interactions that could go right or wrong depending on the choices made by individuals on both sides.